ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
In our recent episode with Steve Nixon of freejazzlessons.com, he gave a few great tips for improving your sense of rhythm, and one of them was to practice transcription, writing down the music you hear. I wanted to unpack that a bit in this episode because it's something that can seem overwhelming, intimidating, and for a lot of musicians today, pointless. But transcription, if you approach it right, can be a seriously powerful vehicle for improving your musicality. We're going to talk about what transcribing music means, why you might want to do it, and how to start learning to transcribe. Let's dive in. What is transcribing music? The word transcribing sounds quite technical, but in this context, it just means writing down what you hear. Where musicians often get tripped up is that we tend to assume that means writing it down in traditional score notation, and that can be intimidating to people who don't read music or who can read it but have never tried to write notation themselves. So first of all, let's clarify. Transcribing does not have to mean using traditional music notation. There are great benefits to that system of writing music, and it's something you might want to work towards as you learn to transcribe. But certainly at the outset, it's not 100% required. For example, if you were trying to transcribe a clarinet melody, you might begin by just writing down the note names. In a minute, we'll talk about why to transcribe, and you'll see that even a simple way of writing it down like this, even though it may be missing elements such as rhythm, can still be very valuable. Or if you play guitar, you might prefer tab notation, and it's perfectly valid to transcribe music in tab. Or perhaps you're just trying to specify the chords to a song you've heard, or one that you're writing, in which case writing a simple chord chart using chord symbols, for example writing a capital C to mean C major, or a capital A followed by a small m to mean A minor, and so on, that would be just fine. Transcribing just means you hear music and you produce some written representation of that music. It might be simplified, it might be informal, or it might be a very in-depth, technical, note-perfect representation. These are all valid forms of transcription. There's one other subtlety to mention before we move on to why you might transcribe. A moment ago I said transcribing means you hear music and you produce some written representation. In fact, you might hear music only in your head. For example, a songwriter might want to write down their ideas for melodies, or a chord progression, or a rhythm, or other song elements. And that process of writing down what they audiate, meaning what they hear in their head, is actually a form of transcription too. Okay, so if that's what transcribing is, what's the point of it? The bottom line is that we transcribe music in order to capture it in a more permanent and versatile format. If we hear music live, or we imagine a new creation in our minds, that's very transient. It's gone after we hear it. If we're able to transcribe what we heard, then we can capture that musical idea in a way that lets it live on. In the case of hearing music in the real world, you might be thinking, yeah, but I could just record it instead. And that's fair enough, you could. And many songwriters, for example, will start by just recording themselves singing a melody, or in some way performing the idea they had. But what about communicating that idea with other musicians so that they can play it immediately on their instrument? What about capturing not just what you played, but how you played it? For example, with an instrument like guitar, where the same note pitch might be played in multiple ways, or where the recording would have so much going on it would be challenging for someone else to decipher what was happening. What about if you're a songwriter who doesn't sing very well and doesn't have an instrument handy? Or you're imagining a chord progression that you would know the chord names for, but you can't easily perform to record it on the spot. Transcription provides you with a clear way to capture musical ideas in a way that other musicians can understand, in as much or as little detail as you want. That's the practical reason to transcribe music, but actually there's another huge reason to transcribe, which is maybe even more valuable. Transcribing music requires you to learn to transcribe music. So let's ask the different question. Why learn to transcribe music? Aside from the practical benefits we just talked about, the process of learning to transcribe is huge for your musicality. Transcribing music requires two distinct skills. The first is being able to write music notation. As we've talked about, that doesn't necessarily have to be traditional score notation, though it could be. The second is having the ear skills needed to translate what you hear, or what you imagine, into those written symbols. I often say that one reason all musicians should have a basic ability to sing in tune is that being able to sing back something you just heard is a real test of whether you heard it clearly or not. And that goes doubly for transcription. To reach a good level of ability in transcribing music requires you to train your ears. While you can do ear training exercises and pass quizzes for things like interval recognition or identifying chord progressions and so on, taking a real piece of music and challenging yourself to write down what you're hearing is the real proof of what your ears are able to do. All of the core ear training we do at Musical U is in the interest of these kinds of practical tasks. And whether you want to pick up your instrument and play what you just heard or imagined, or you want to write it down on a piece of paper and produce a transcription, the ear skills you need are exactly the same. Want better ears for rhythm? Use transcribing rhythms as your benchmark. Want to recognize chords by ear? Challenge yourself to write down the chord progressions you hear in songs. Wishing you had a better understanding of song structure and compositional form? If you can transcribe it, then you've got it. Now, I'm not saying just jump in and start trying to transcribe complex music. That is a recipe for frustration. You want to take advantage of the core ear training exercises, just like you want to take the time to understand how notation works. But the practical task of transcription can be the perfect vehicle for guiding that training and giving you a very clear proof of how you're improving. So that's actually my main advice on the how to learn to transcribe front. You want to address the two component skills, being able to understand and write notation, and having a well-trained ear to translate what you hear into that written format. Both of these are areas which benefit from dedicated exercises focusing just on those core skills. For example, at Musical U, we have training modules for notes and melodies, for chords, for rhythms, and so on. Learning to write down notation also has a big side benefit that it helps you to better understand how to read notation, and doing this for transcription provides you with a much more integrated sense of how the written symbols correspond to the musical sounds you hear. For example, if you're used to transcribing complex eighth note rhythmic patterns, you aren't going to have any difficulty sight reading them when they come along in new music you're learning. As well as working on the two component skills, you want to also practice the task itself. Start trying to transcribe, and remember that you absolutely do not have to write down every note and rhythm of every instrument you hear. Maybe you could start out with a singer-songwriter you like, and try just writing down the notes of their vocal melody. Or you could listen to their guitar or piano, and try writing down the chord progression in Roman numerals, or you could figure out the key and use chord names. See if you can write down the rhythms being used. So to sum up, transcription does not mean writing down every aspect of complex music in traditional score notation. It's actually a totally versatile activity, both in terms of what you're trying to write down and how you choose to notate it. Transcription can be a valuable part of your musicality training at any time, and it provides you with a wonderful vehicle for developing your understanding of written notation as well as your ear skills, both of which will then benefit you in myriad ways throughout your musical life.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's musicalitypodcast.com.